I'm joined now by Agnes Monod-Gayraud, a translator and writer of children's books, who brought with her one of her latest works, which is The Book of Bees, a book she translated. It was written by Piotr Socha, and as you can imagine, it's a book about bees. Hello, Agnes, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Could you tell us a little bit about this latest book and why Piotr Socha, the author, thought that a book about bees would be interesting for children?
Well, first I have to say it's not my latest project. My latest project is a book about patents done by the Migelińscy, who are quite well known in the world of children's publishing all over the world. Their maps sold millions of copies, and they're quite popular. And I think they launched the boom of Polish children's illustration in other countries around the world. Books like this one, The Book of Bees, is actually riding that wave because Maps, which was illustrated by the Migelińscy, there are a couple of illustrators. They launched the trend for big format books that children can open and touch and look at in intricate detail. And like I said, that became a trend, and this book is part of that trend, trying to bring to life the very important topic of bees, which I think is very relevant to our society today, and make it bring out every detail of their nature, their history. The history of bees is actually quite old. They've been around for at least, as Piotr Socha says in the book, at least 1 million years, and how important they are to our lives today. So as Piotr Socha says in the book, bees have been around for at least as long as the dinosaurs, at least 100 million years, as we have seen from bee remnants found in amber. We go all the way from 100 million years ago to today, and we're starting to realize how important bees are to our lives today.
Now, there is a long tradition in international children's literature of turning monsters into children's stories. Is something similar going on here? Children are generally afraid of bees. They think that bees might sting and they might hurt. Is Piotr Socha trying to bring children closer and understand bees and not be afraid of these little insects?
I think so, although the book doesn't glamorize the bee too much, because it's very factual. I mean, I felt at times while I was doing the translation, I felt very moved by the bee's story, because the truth is most bees only live about 5 or 6 weeks, and that's not something you realize. The queen bee can live up to 7 years, but all of the drones, they only live a few weeks at a time, and the males can even live just a few days, because, as it turns out, male bees are good for nothing but impregnating the queen. So once they do that their role is done, and they're shut out of the hive, and they basically starve to death.
That's a gruesome end. What does the book say about the modern role of the bees in terms of pollinating flowers? We know that the bees are in decline. And what does the book say about that? Is it a warning bell, trying to teach kids to protect nature in any way?
The book doesn't really lecture children too much. Most of what it does is it on each spread, it discusses every aspect of the bee's life and the bee's nature, from the way it's built, from the way it builds to the way it builds its hive, to how it raises its young or their young, because the entire hive contributes to the raising of the young, and it also discusses how they communicate with each other, because bees have their own language in the way that they rub their wings together, and they also have a special waggle dance that they do to signal to the other bees where the nearest flowers can be found. So they have a very complex nature, very complex ways of communicating with each other. And also the book talks about how humans have been inspired by bees, for example, in architecture and design. The book also tells us how essential bees are to our way of life. So we wouldn't have flowers without bees, because flowers developed in response to bees. They wanted flowers are so beautiful because they wanted, in an evolutionary sense, to become more attractive to bees, so bees would be more eager to visit them and to help them pollinate. And also, without this pollination, many of the fruits and vegetables we enjoy just wouldn't be around. And it's only towards the end of the book that Piotr Socha discusses the dangers of bees dying out as a result of pesticides or whatever else happens to be killing them off at the moment. And there's a fact he quotes that in the U.S. alone, the work of bees is estimated at about $15 million per year. So with bees gone, farmers have to shell out that money to find other ways of pollinating their plants. So really, the work of bees is not only admirable, but it's also valuable in cash.
Now, that's all very interesting, but I'd also like to know a little bit about your role as a translator of this book. Could you tell us a little bit about what goes into translating a book from the original Polish into a book in English? And I understand that you also did various versions, British English, American English.
Yes, but the British English and American versions are essentially the same. The editors at each of the publishers, so you have Thames and Hudson and in the UK and Abrams in North America, each of the editors there have adapted the book to their needs, including, because the book also includes recipes for honey cake and so on, so the recipes had to be adjusted for each population. And I have to say, everyone says that learning Polish is very difficult. And Polish is a difficult language, and it's a difficult language to translate. I'm sure that it's the case with many languages, but, very often you have phrases that are very difficult to translate. If you translate them directly, they just sound awkward. So I realized the best way to translate a book is actually to rewrite the book, but in English. So my method was to kind of absorb each paragraph on a page and rewrite it as if I were writing it from scratch. And then going back to that paragraph and seeing if the language was authentic and if it could be improved and if it could sound as if it wasn't a translation, but it had been written in the first instance by me, you could say. Although obviously all the majority of the work is the author's, because he came up with the concept and the topics and exactly the way he wanted to phrase each story that he's telling about the bees. Because actually what a lot of book reviewers notice about the book, both in its Polish version and its English version, is that it's very humorous, very whimsical, it's fun to read. And so adults who are going over this book with their children are actually having fun at the same time, because it gives them a lot of information that is valuable for them and in a way that is fun for them also to read.
Let's talk about the children's book industry. You obviously know more about this than I do, although I do have children and I do read out to my children. But I've noticed that there's a trend in recent years of children's books which are of a more serious nature than when I was young, which were all about simple themes. But nowadays, even with a book like this, it talks about bees. It's very scientific in part, but it's telling us a bigger message. Have you noticed a similar trend in children's books in recent years?
Well, yes, I also have children, so I see it with my children. They're only 2.5 and 3.5 years old, but in my 3.5-year-old, I already see interest in real scientific discovery. Obviously, he has his limits, but I think we put more limits on children than they put on themselves. And so he's really interested in the life of insects. He's always asking questions. So I think by raising the bar and using a more rich vocabulary and a richer subject matter from an earlier age, you prepare your child for a lifetime of asking questions and inquiry, even about things that seem complex at the beginning. But the more you talk about them, the easier I think it becomes. And I think it's a nice trend. I think parents are discovering that that books offer something that tablets and computer games don't. And it's also a very special moment that you can share with your child, where it's you and your child or your children reading a book together and sharing that experience. And that's one of the best ways of spending quality time with your kids.
Thank you very much. My guest was Agnes Monod-Gayraud, a writer and translator of children's books. Thanks for coming. And for News from Poland, I'm Roberto Galea.